It was a sweltering summer evening in Milwaukee on July 22nd, 1991, when police officers Ralph Muller and Robert Routh responded to a disturbance call that would lead to one of the most horrifying discoveries in modern crime history. A man named Tracy Edwards had flagged them down, his wrists still bound by a handcuff, claiming he had narrowly escaped from someone trying to kill him. His voice trembled, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He led the officers to an unassuming apartment on North 25th Street, Unit 213. What awaited them inside would shake not only Milwaukee, but the entire world. The apartment door opened to reveal Jeffrey Dahmer, a quiet, polite man who appeared almost ordinary. But as the officers stepped inside, the stench hit them first, a foul, rotting odor that clung to the air. Searching for the key to remove Edwards' handcuffs, one officer opened a bedside drawer. Inside were Polaroid photographs, dozens of them, each depicting bodies in various stages of dismemberment. They were not staged horror props. They were real, raw, and brutally explicit. The faces were lifeless, their bodies contorted in unnatural positions. In that instant, the officers realized they had walked into a nightmare. A deeper search of Dahmer's apartment revealed a scene so grotesque it seemed beyond human comprehension. In the refrigerator lay a severed human head. In the freezer, wrapped parcels of flesh. A large blue barrel in the corner contained several torsos dissolving in acid. Skulls were neatly stored in a cabinet, and preserved organs floated in jars like macabre trophies. It was not just a crime scene, it was the home of a predator who had been hunting in plain sight for years. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a shadowy figure lurking in dark alleys. He lived in a small apartment complex, greeting neighbors with a nod, often blending into the background of everyday life. His mild manner and shy demeanor gave no hint of the horrors hidden behind his door. To the world outside, he was just another face in the crowd. A neighbor, the man in the grocery store line, the quiet tenant down the hall. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. Over the course of 13 years, from 1978 to 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys. His crimes were not just about killing, they were about complete control, domination, and a twisted desire to possess his victims forever. He lured them in with promises of money, drinks, or companionship, then drugged and strangled them. But death was only the beginning. He engaged in acts of necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism, preserving parts of their bodies as mementos. The details shocked even seasoned investigators. Dahmer's confession was cold and matter-of-fact, delivered without hesitation or remorse. He described how he kept certain body parts for comfort, how he photographed his victims to remember them, and how he experimented with drilling holes into their skulls to create zombie-like, compliant partners. The sheer brutality and methodical nature of his crimes stunned the world. How could someone commit such acts while maintaining a facade of normalcy? How could a man live among neighbors, shop at local stores, even invite people over, while hiding evidence of murder in every room? The media quickly dubbed him the Milwaukee Cannibal and the monster next door. His case became one of the most infamous in criminal history, not only for the horrific nature of the murders, but also for the haunting reality that evil can wear an ordinary face. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. At first glance, his early years seemed unremarkable, the kind of suburban, middle American childhood that would not foreshadow the horrors he would one day commit. But beneath the surface, there were cracks forming in both the family and the boy himself. Jeffrey's father, Lionel, was a chemist, often preoccupied with his studies and later his career. His mother, Joyce, struggled with mental health issues, bouts of depression, and a tendency toward hypochondria. Their marriage was far from harmonious. Arguments were frequent, and the emotional tension in the household was palpable. Friends and neighbors would later recall that the Dahmer home did not feel warm or welcoming. There was an undercurrent of strain that seemed to seep into Jeffrey's young life. As a child, Jeffrey was described as quiet and polite, but unusually withdrawn. He rarely cried or demanded attention, preferring to sit alone and watch others rather than join in. Teachers noted he was shy, with few friends, though in his earliest years he did have moments of playfulness and curiosity. Still, even in kindergarten, there was a certain emotional distance about him. The first signs of something darker began to appear around the age of 4. While most children were fascinated by pets or cartoons, Jeffrey became intrigued by the lifeless bodies of small animals he found in the woods or along roads. On one occasion, he watched his father remove animal bones from under the house, an experience that seemed to ignite a strange fascination. Lionel recalled that Jeffrey was unusually interested in how the bones fit together, in the structure and feel of them. This curiosity soon turned into a quiet obsession. As he grew older, Jeffrey would collect the remains of dead animals, roadkill, birds, squirrels, and bring them home. Sometimes he stored them in jars of formaldehyde. Other times he dissected them to see how they worked. To him, these activities were not cruel acts, but rather experiments, though they hinted at a disturbing lack of empathy. By his early teens, Jeffrey had become increasingly isolated. The family moved several times due to Lionel's work, and each move seemed to deepen Jeffrey's sense of detachment. Making friends was difficult for him, and he often retreated into his own world. He was intelligent but unmotivated in school, preferring solitary hobbies to team activities. When he did interact with classmates, it was often through strange, unsettling humor, mimicking seizures or speech impediments to get a laugh. The cracks in the Dahmer household widened as his parents' marriage deteriorated. Their arguments grew louder and more frequent, and Jeffrey often retreated to the woods near their home. There, away from human interaction, his fascination with death deepened. He began to fantasize not just about dead animals, but about complete control over another being, a dark seed that would one day grow into lethal intent. Around this time, Jeffrey also began struggling with his sexuality. He realized he was attracted to men, but in the conservative social climate of the time, he kept this hidden. His fantasies, however, began to merge with his earlier fascinations. In his mind, sexual attraction and control, even over lifeless bodies, became intertwined. He imagined scenarios where his partners could never leave, never reject him. When Jeffrey was in high school, his drinking began. Alcohol became a coping mechanism for his loneliness, confusion, and growing compulsions. Classmates recalled that he sometimes drank beer or hard liquor in class, hiding it in a paper bag or water bottle. Despite his odd behavior, some peers found him amusing in small doses, dubbing his antics as doing a Dahmer when he acted out in bizarre ways. But most kept their distance. In 1978, shortly after his parents' divorce, Jeffrey's world fractured completely. His mother moved away with his younger brother, leaving Jeffrey alone in the family home for a time. Lionel was living elsewhere, and there was little supervision or emotional support. The loneliness was now absolute, and the dark thoughts he had harbored for years were no longer just idle fantasies. Only weeks after graduating from high school, Dahmer committed his first murder, a brutal act that would set him on the path to becoming one of the most infamous serial killers in history. But those who later studied his life would point back to his childhood and teenage years. The quiet boy in the corner, the collector of bones, the child growing up in a fractured home, as the time when the seeds of darkness were sown. Jeffrey Dahmer's early life is a chilling reminder that evil often develops in silence, nurtured not by sudden explosions of violence, but by years of hidden obsessions, emotional neglect, and an ever-deepening isolation. By the time the world met him in 1991, the boy he had once been was long gone, replaced by the monster next door. In the summer of 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old, freshly graduated from high school, and living alone in the family home in Bath Township, Ohio. His parents' bitter divorce had fractured what little stability he had, and his mother had moved away with his younger brother David. His father, Lionel, was living in a motel during the separation. For the first time in his life, Jeffrey had complete freedom. No parental oversight, no rules, and no one to witness what was about to unfold. On June 18, 1978, Dahmer was driving along a rural road when he spotted 18-year-old Stephen Hicks hitchhiking. Hicks, carrying his guitar, was on his way to a rock concert in Chippewa Lake Park. Dahmer slowed down, pulled over, and offered Hicks a ride. By his own later admission, Jeffrey was immediately attracted to the young man. His earlier fantasies, merging sexual desire with the idea of possessing someone completely, began to surge. As they drove, Dahmer invited Hicks back to his house for a few beers before continuing to the concert. Hicks agreed, seeing no harm in stopping for a drink. Once inside, the two spent several hours talking, drinking, and listening to music. Hicks was friendly and relaxed, but as the afternoon wore on, he began to mention that he needed to get going. For Dahmer, this was the trigger. The thought of Hicks walking out the door, of losing control, ignited something deep inside him. He didn't want Hicks to leave. Not now, not ever. In his later confession, Dahmer described how panic and desire intertwined in that moment. He couldn't bear the idea of being abandoned again, a wound already raw from his fractured family life. He reached for a dumbbell from his weight set. As Hicks stood with his back turned, Dahmer struck him on the head from behind. Hicks fell to the floor, dazed and bleeding, but still alive. Dahmer then wrapped his hands around Hicks's throat and strangled him until he stopped breathing. The reality of what he had done began to sink in. In the silence of the house, Dahmer stood over the body, feeling both horror and an intoxicating sense of power. He later admitted that this first kill was not simply about silencing Hicks. It was about keeping him there, under control, unable to leave. For several hours, Dahmer sat with the body, touching it, examining it, unable to let go. Eventually, he decided to dispose of it. Using a hunting knife, he dismembered Hicks in the basement. He cut the body into pieces, placing the remains in garbage bags. Some parts he buried in a shallow grave behind the house. Weeks later, driven by curiosity, he dug them up, stripped the flesh from the bones, and used acid to dissolve the flesh. The clean bones were then smashed with a sledgehammer and scattered in the woods. In the weeks that followed, Dahmer appeared outwardly calm. No one suspected that a murder had occurred in the quiet home. Hicks's disappearance was noted, but with no immediate leads, it faded into the growing list of unsolved cases. For Dahmer, however, the experience had planted something irreversible. He had crossed the line from fantasy into reality, and survived it. There were no police at his door, no witnesses, no punishment. In his mind, this first kill confirmed two things: that he could act on his darkest desires, and that he could get away with it. This first murder set the template for what would come in the years ahead. The pattern was already there. The lure of companionship, the sudden shift when the victim wanted to leave, the violent act to ensure they stayed, and the meticulous disposal of the body to erase evidence. Dahmer's later murders would follow this same chilling script, refined and repeated with increasing confidence. Looking back, Dahmer would describe the killing of Stephen Hicks as the moment everything changed. It was the point of no return, the beginning of a nightmare that would span more than a decade, claiming the lives of 16 more men and boys. In 1978, Stephen Hicks became the first name on a long and tragic list, a young man whose only mistake was accepting a ride from a stranger. For Jeffrey Dahmer, it was the moment the monster inside him found its voice. After the murder of Stephen Hicks in 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer's life entered what investigators would later call a quiet period. It was not that his dark urges had vanished, They simmered just beneath the surface. But circumstances, including a brief stint in college and service in the U.S. Army, kept them from escalating. By the mid-1980s, however, Dahmer had settled into a routine that allowed his two worlds to coexist: the polite, unassuming neighbor and the predator in the shadows. To most who encountered him, Jeffrey Dahmer was forgettable in the most ordinary way. He was shy, soft-spoken, and rarely drew attention to himself. In the apartment building where he lived on Milwaukee's North 25th Street, neighbors often saw him carrying groceries, exchanging a polite nod in the hallway, or quietly listening to music in his unit. He didn't throw loud parties, didn't cause trouble, and paid his rent on time. For many, he was just Jeff, the quiet guy down the hall. But behind the closed door of apartment 213, Dahmer's true life was far from ordinary. His private world was built on deception, compulsion, and fantasies that grew darker with each passing year. By the mid-1980s, he had already served time for nonviolent offenses, a warning sign that, in hindsight, pointed toward the storm ahead. The first public crack in his facade came in 1982 when he was arrested for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair Park. Witnesses reported that Dahmer had exposed himself to a crowd that included children. He was fined and given a suspended sentence, a small legal blemish that barely registered with those around him. Dahmer, outwardly embarrassed, promised it was a one-time lapse in judgment, but the behavior didn't stop. In 1986, he was arrested again, this time for masturbating in front of two boys near the Kinnickinnic River. Initially charged with open lewdness, he claimed he had merely been urinating and was misunderstood. The charge was reduced to disorderly conduct, and he was sentenced to 1 year of probation. To neighbors and co-workers, it was just another odd incident in the life of an otherwise quiet man. To those who study criminal behavior, it was a glaring red flag, an inability to control deviant impulses in public, suggesting an even more dangerous private life. During this time, Dahmer worked at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory in Milwaukee. His job was steady, if monotonous, and his co-workers described him as reliable but distant. He rarely joined social outings, preferring to keep to himself. This solitary nature allowed him to maintain his double life: respectable worker by day, prowler by night. In his free time, Dahmer frequented local gay bars and bathhouses. It was in these spaces that his predatory behavior began to escalate again. He developed a habit of drugging other men, using sleeping pills to render them unconscious before engaging in sexual activity. Though he was banned from several establishments for these acts, law enforcement intervention remained minimal. The secrecy of his life was both his shield and his prison. Outwardly, he could pass as harmless, just another quiet tenant in a low-income neighborhood. Internally, his fantasies of control and possession were becoming more vivid and insistent. His early arrests for indecent exposure and sexual misconduct did little to curb these desires. If anything, they reinforced the thrill of risk. What made Dahmer's double life so effective was his ability to compartmentalize. To his landlord, he was a model tenant. To his grandmother, with whom he lived for several years, he was a somewhat troubled but caring grandson who attended church and helped with chores. Yet during those same years, he was luring men into situations where they were rendered powerless, testing the boundaries of how far he could go. This contrast, the mild-mannered neighbor versus the manipulative offender, would later shock the public as much as the crimes themselves. It was the chilling realization that a man who could commit such atrocities could also sit quietly in the lobby, greet you in the hallway, and offer you a beer without a hint of menace. By the late 1980s, the mask Dahmer wore in public was firmly in place, but beneath it, the darkness was growing restless. His run-ins with the law were no longer enough to satisfy him. Soon the quiet neighbor would vanish, replaced by the predator who could no longer keep his urges hidden. The nightmare was about to begin again, and this time, it would not stop. By the late 1980s, Jeffrey Dahmer had perfected the mask that allowed him to move unnoticed through the city. By day, he was a quiet factory worker who kept to himself. By night, he was a predator searching for his next victim. His chosen hunting grounds were not dark alleys or shadowed parks. They were public spaces filled with music, laughter, and human connection. Milwaukee's gay bars and bathhouses. These places offered him exactly what he wanted: anonymity, opportunity, and a steady stream of potential victims. In the crowded, dimly lit rooms of gay clubs, Dahmer could watch without drawing suspicion. He studied his targets carefully, noting who was alone, who seemed trusting, who might be persuaded to leave with a stranger. Dahmer's method was simple but effective. He would approach men with a friendly demeanor, striking up casual conversation. Sometimes he offered them money, anywhere from $50 to $100, in exchange for posing for photographs or spending time with him. Other times he promised a relaxed evening with drinks at his apartment. For some, it was an easy offer to accept. For others, curiosity or attraction was enough. Once they agreed, Dahmer's calm, polite nature put them at ease. He often targeted men who were on the margins, individuals who might not be immediately missed, whose disappearances would not trigger urgent investigations. Many of his victims were young, some struggling with unstable housing, others simply seeking companionship in a community that, at the time, faced widespread discrimination. Dahmer exploited this vulnerability with chilling precision. In the bathhouses he frequented, Dahmer's predatory nature became more apparent to those who crossed his path. He began drugging his partners, slipping sleeping pills into their drinks to render them unconscious. At first, these encounters did not always end in death. Dahmer claimed he simply wanted his partners to remain still and compliant, to stay with him without interruption. But the line between control and killing was thin, and it would not hold for long. By 1987, his urges could no longer be contained. That year, he met 25-year-old Stephen Tuomi at a bar and lured him to a hotel room. Dahmer claimed he had no intention of killing Tuomi, but when he awoke the next morning, Tuomi was dead beside him. Dahmer later said he had no memory of the act itself, a statement that investigators would view with skepticism. Regardless, Tuomi's death marked the beginning of his killing spree in earnest. From that point on, Dahmer's approach was calculated and methodical. In the bars, he blended in, a quiet presence with a drink in hand, scanning the crowd. Once he identified a target, he knew exactly what to say, how to smile, and how to make himself seem safe. He avoided aggression, preferring to lure rather than force. The promise of money, alcohol, or a friendly evening was often enough to seal the deal. Back at his apartment, the trap would spring shut. Drinks were prepared, strong, sweet, and laced with sedatives. Within minutes, his guests would slip into unconsciousness, leaving them at Dahmer's mercy. For him, this was the moment of ultimate control, when the person before him could not leave, could not resist. What followed was a grim and familiar ritual: strangulation, dismemberment, and the preservation of body parts as trophies. These hunting grounds, the clubs, the bars, the bathhouses, gave Dahmer everything he needed to sustain his double life. The crowds made it easy to blend in, the noise masked his movements, and the late hours provided a perfect cover for his activities. Few questioned why he left with different men on different nights. In that scene, it was not unusual. To outsiders, Dahmer's presence in these spaces was unremarkable. To those who would later investigate his crimes, they were the fertile fields where he honed his methods and fed his compulsions. Each victim was carefully chosen, each encounter carefully planned. By the early 1990s, Jeffrey Dahmer had transformed himself into a master predator, one who could stand in the middle of a crowded room, smiling politely, while already imagining the lifeless body he would soon possess. His hunting grounds were not just places of nightlife, they were the beginning of a nightmare for every man who followed him home. By 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer had moved into a one-bedroom apartment at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. From the outside, the Oxford Apartments looked unremarkable, a drab, aging building in a working-class neighborhood. But inside Unit 213, Dahmer had created a space designed for one purpose: to lure, kill, and keep his victims. The setup was meticulous. The living room was kept tidy, almost sterile, with neatly arranged furniture and a fish tank that provided a soft, distracting glow. The kitchen appeared normal at first glance, but it was here that much of the horror took place. In his bedroom, a small nightstand drawer held Polaroid photographs, dozens of them, showing his victims in various stages of undress, unconsciousness, and death. The images were trophies, a way for him to relive each killing long after it was over. Every detail in the apartment was calculated to maintain control. Dahmer kept a steady supply of alcohol and prescription sedatives to incapacitate his guests. Once inside, victims were offered a drink, usually spiked with sleeping pills. Within minutes, they would be unconscious, their fate sealed. What happened next was as methodical as it was monstrous. Strangulation was Dahmer's preferred method of killing, quiet and efficient. Once the victim was dead, the dismemberment began. Using large knives and sometimes even a power saw, Dahmer separated limbs from torsos, carefully removing skin and muscle. The remains were processed in different ways. Some were placed in a blue 57-gallon barrel filled with acid for disposal. Others were wrapped and stored in the refrigerator or freezer. Certain body parts were preserved, skulls cleaned and bleached, bones kept as souvenirs, and occasionally entire skeletons assembled for display. In his closet, investigators later found painted skulls, human bones, and boxes containing organs. In jars of formaldehyde, he stored hearts, genitals, and other preserved remains. Cannibalism became part of Dahmer's ritual. He admitted to cooking and eating parts of his victims, claiming it was a way to feel closer to them, to make them a permanent part of me. This act blurred the line between possession and consumption, turning his crimes into something even more grotesque. The apartment's most disturbing feature was its ordinariness. Neighbors noticed strange smells and occasionally complained, but Dahmer explained them away. Spoiled meat, a broken refrigerator, dead tropical fish. The excuses were believable enough, and life in the building went on. Few suspected that just a thin wall separated them from one of the most prolific and sadistic killers in American history. Unit 213 became both Dahmer's sanctuary and his prison. It was where he could indulge his darkest fantasies without interruption, but also where he became trapped in a cycle of killing he could not stop. Every time he stepped outside, he had to put the mask back on, the quiet, polite man with nothing to hide. Inside, the mask came off, and the apartment became a factory of death. When police finally entered in July 1991, they described the scene as something out of a nightmare. Photographs, skulls, bones, severed heads in the refrigerator, and a barrel filled with decomposing remains. It was not just a crime scene, it was a museum of horror, carefully curated by the man who had lived there in plain sight. For the neighbors of 924 North 25th Street, the realization was chilling. The man they had passed in the hallway, the one who nodded politely and held the door, had been living among them as a predator, turning his home into a slaughterhouse. On the night of May 27, 1991, a chance at stopping Jeffrey Dahmer forever slipped through law enforcement's hands. It was a failure so devastating that it would haunt Milwaukee for years to come and claim more lives in the weeks that followed. 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomphone had been lured to Dahmer's apartment with the promise of money for posing for photographs. Like so many before him, he accepted a drink that had been laced with sedatives. Dahmer's plan was already in motion. After the boy lost consciousness, Dahmer drilled a hole in his skull and injected a mixture of water and hydrochloric acid in an attempt to create a compliant, zombie-like partner. But something went wrong. Konorak regained consciousness, disoriented and in pain. Seizing his only chance, he staggered out of the apartment and into the street. Naked, bleeding, and barely able to speak, he drew the attention of two young women who immediately called 911. When police officers John Balcherzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived, they found the women trying to comfort the dazed teenager. Dahmer appeared moments later, calm and collected, telling the officers that Konorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had simply had too much to drink after a lover's quarrel. The women protested, pointing out the boy's obvious injuries and his terrified attempts to pull away from Dahmer. Instead of investigating further, the officers chose to believe Dahmer's story. The combination of homophobia, racial bias, and a lack of urgency proved fatal. The women were told to leave, and the officers escorted Konorak back to Dahmer's apartment. There, Dahmer offered the officers a brief look inside, a glance that revealed nothing of the horrors hidden just out of sight. The officers even joked among themselves about reuniting the lovers before leaving. As soon as the door closed, Dahmer's mask dropped. He immediately killed Konarak, later posing his body for Polaroids before dismembering him. In the refrigerator at the time was the severed head of another victim, hidden just feet from where the officers had stood. The tragedy was compounded by an earlier missed opportunity. In 1988, Dahmer had been arrested and convicted for sexually assaulting Konarak's older brother, Somsak Synthesomphone. He served only a year in prison before being released, with no significant monitoring. The connection between the two brothers was never realized until it was far too late. The police failure in the Konarak case became one of the most infamous moments in Dahmer's story. Had the officers checked Dahmer's record, questioned the boy at a hospital, or conducted a proper search, they would have discovered the truth and stopped the killing spree. Instead, their decision handed Dahmer his victim back, allowing him to continue murdering for nearly 2 more months. For the families of Konarak and the other victims who died afterward, the pain was made worse by knowing that this moment could have been the end of Dahmer's reign of terror. Instead, it became a haunting reminder of how prejudice, negligence, and misplaced trust can cost lives. It was a sweltering afternoon in Milwaukee on July 22, 1991, when the nightmare that had haunted the city for over a decade finally came to an end. The capture of Jeffrey Dahmer was not the result of meticulous detective work or a breakthrough in criminal profiling. It was the desperate courage of a young man who refused to become another victim. That man was 32-year-old Tracy Edwards. Edwards had met Dahmer earlier that day at a gay bar. Dahmer, polite and unassuming as ever, offered Edwards a ride home. What seemed like a routine gesture of friendliness soon turned into a harrowing struggle for survival. Once inside Dahmer's apartment, Edwards quickly realized he had walked into a trap. Dahmer attempted to subdue him with handcuffs and sedatives, just as he had with so many others before. But Edwards fought back. In a frantic bid for life, he broke free and ran down the street, nearly naked, screaming for help. Passers-by were initially confused, but Edwards' frantic cries caught the attention of police officers Ralph Mueller and Robert Routh. When questioned, he explained that Dahmer had tried to kill him and had bound him in the apartment. The officers, sensing urgency, followed Edwards back to Dahmer's apartment at 924 North 25th Street. When they knocked on the door, Dahmer opened it calmly, as if nothing were wrong. He explained to the officers that Edwards was his adult lover, who had been drinking excessively and had simply become unruly. He tried to present himself as the victim, manipulating the police with his ordinary appearance and polite demeanor. But something in the officers' instincts told them to look deeper. Inside apartment 213, they discovered a scene that would shock even seasoned law enforcement officers. The air was thick with the stench of decay. A closet contained Polaroid photographs of unconscious and lifeless men, trophies documenting Dahmer's crimes. The refrigerator held a severed human head, carefully wrapped, while the freezer contained other human remains. A blue barrel in the corner housed decomposing torsos, and jars of preserved organs lined the shelves, their macabre contents floating in formaldehyde. Skulls, bones, and remnants of multiple victims were scattered throughout the apartment, a horrifying museum of murder meticulously curated by Dahmer. The officers immediately arrested Dahmer. He offered little resistance, his polite demeanor now tinged with resignation. In his calm, matter-of-fact way, he admitted to having killed and dismembered 17 young men over the course of more than a decade. He confessed to acts of necrophilia and cannibalism, explaining that he had kept certain body parts as trophies to preserve the memory of his victims. The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer sent shockwaves through Milwaukee and the world. How could a man so ordinary in appearance, living in a modest apartment, have committed such unspeakable acts for so long without detection? The images taken from his apartment, the detailed confessions, and the sheer scale of his crimes left the public reeling. Tracy Edwards, the man whose courage had triggered Dahmer's capture, became a symbol of survival and resilience. Had he not escaped, Dahmer's killing spree might have continued, claiming even more lives. Edwards' bravery finally exposed the monster living quietly next door. After his arrest on July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer did something almost unimaginable. He began speaking openly with investigators. In the days and weeks that followed, he provided detailed, matter-of-fact accounts of his crimes: 17 murders, acts of necrophilia, dismemberment, and even cannibalism. What made his confessions so chilling was not merely the acts themselves, but the eerie calm and lack of remorse with which he recounted them. Dahmer's interviews began immediately, as police sought to understand the full extent of his atrocities. He spoke quietly, almost monotonously, describing how he selected victims, lured them into his apartment, and executed them. His admissions were devoid of emotional turmoil. There was no guilt, no sadness, only cold calculation. He explained step by step how he incapacitated his victims with alcohol or sedatives, then strangled them, often while imagining a permanent companionship that death could provide. When asked why he killed, Dahmer gave answers that were as disturbing as they were revealing. He admitted that he had long struggled with a compulsion to exert total control over others, combined with a desire to create a lifeless companion who would never leave or reject him. In his own words, he killed to satisfy an obsession with possession and permanence, seeking to stop the fleeting nature of relationships that had eluded him since childhood. The interviews also revealed his fascination with the human body, a curiosity that had started in his youth. Dahmer spoke of dissecting animals and collecting bones, explaining how this interest escalated into experimenting with his victims' bodies. He described in clinical detail how he preserved body parts, photographed his victims, and sometimes consumed flesh. He claimed that these acts were part of his way of holding on to the people he desired, of making them a permanent part of him. Investigators noted that Dahmer did not attempt to rationalize or excuse his actions to gain sympathy. He simply explained them as if recounting a scientific experiment. His demeanor was unsettling, a quiet intelligence married to an almost total emotional detachment. He described the murders with precision, noting the physical sensations, the positions of the bodies, and the methods used to dispose of remains, all without a hint of remorse. This lack of emotional response was one of the most frightening aspects for investigators and the public alike. Here was a man who had committed unspeakable acts not in a moment of rage, but deliberately, repeatedly, and without any apparent moral conflict. Dahmer's calm articulation of his crimes forced law enforcement to confront the reality of a mind entirely consumed by obsession, yet capable of careful planning, patience, and deception. Ultimately, Dahmer's confessions provided the evidence needed for prosecution and gave the public an unsettling window into the psyche of a serial killer. His ability to describe murder, dismemberment, and cannibalism without remorse highlighted a level of detachment that remains profoundly disturbing. A reminder that evil does not always scream for attention, but can live quietly in a mind that has long since severed itself from conscience. When Jeffrey Dahmer finally faced the legal system, the world watched in a mixture of horror and disbelief. The courtroom in Milwaukee became the epicenter of one of the most notorious criminal trials in American history. The case drew intense media scrutiny, with reporters, cameras, and photographers filling every corner of the court, eager to document every detail of the man who had shocked the nation. The trial began in January 1992, and from the start, it was clear that Dahmer's presence alone created a chilling spectacle. He sat quietly in a gray suit, emotionless and calm, occasionally nodding politely as lawyers spoke. In the courtroom gallery, the victims' families tried to contain their grief, while journalists captured every expression, every pause, and every word. The tension was palpable. This was not just a trial. It was a confrontation between ordinary society and the mind of a calculated killer. Prosecutors laid out a harrowing case. They presented evidence meticulously gathered during Dahmer's arrest. Photographs of victims, preserved body parts, and Polaroids showing the grisly details of his murders. Each piece of evidence was described in painstaking detail, painting a picture of premeditation, obsession, and cruelty. Witnesses, including former neighbors and acquaintances, testified about Dahmer's seemingly normal public demeanor and the subtle warning signs they had noticed over the years. The contrast between the polite neighbor and the monster inside his apartment stunned the jury. The media frenzy surrounding the trial was unprecedented. Every day, newspapers and television channels recounted Dahmer's crimes in vivid detail. Public interest was immense, fueled not only by the grotesque nature of the acts, but also by Dahmer's calm and detached demeanor. He gave interviews from his cell in which he confessed to all 17 murders, offering chilling explanations that only amplified the public's fascination and revulsion. Dahmer's defense team argued that he was legally insane at the time of the killings, claiming that his ability to act rationally was compromised by deep-seated psychological disorders. They attempted to portray him as a man consumed by uncontrollable urges, unable to distinguish right from wrong. Psychiatric experts were called to testify, analyzing his behavior, his childhood, and his patterns of obsession. However, the prosecution countered with detailed accounts of Dahmer's careful planning, manipulation, and ability to evade detection, evidence that suggested he understood the nature of his crimes and sought to conceal them. After weeks of testimony, cross-examination, and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. On February 15, 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison. The judge, acknowledging the horrific nature of his crimes, imposed the maximum penalty allowed under Wisconsin law. The families of the victims experienced a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but it could never bring back their loved ones. The trial and sentencing of Jeffrey Dahmer remain a landmark in criminal history. It was a case that exposed the depths of human depravity while showcasing the limits of the justice system in comprehending and responding to such calculated evil. For the public, the courtroom drama, the evidence, and the media coverage provided a window into the unimaginable. The life and mind of a man who had lived among them as a neighbor, yet committed atrocities beyond comprehension. After his conviction in 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he began a life behind bars that would be as closely scrutinized as his crimes had been. Sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, Dahmer entered prison as a figure of notoriety. Guards, inmates, and visitors alike were acutely aware of who he was, the man who had terrorized Milwaukee for over a decade. Prison life was a stark contrast to Dahmer's years of isolation and control. In prison, he was stripped of his freedom and power, forced to live under constant supervision, and surrounded by people who feared and despised him. Yet Dahmer attempted to adapt. He became a model inmate in many ways. He worked in the prison's laundry, participated in religious programs, and attended therapy sessions. He read the Bible diligently and even formed a limited number of acquaintances among fellow inmates, occasionally engaging in conversations about religion, self-reflection, and remorse. Despite these efforts, Dahmer remained a controversial and deeply disliked figure among the prison population. Many inmates harbored resentment toward him for the heinous nature of his crimes, particularly his sexual offenses against young men. His reputation made him a target, and for much of his time behind bars, he required constant supervision to prevent attacks from fellow prisoners. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer's life came to a violent and abrupt end. He, Christopher Scarver, and Jesse Anderson were assigned to work together cleaning a bathroom in a prison work detail, a routine chore under what would later be described as insufficient supervision. Scarver, who had long harbored hostility toward Dahmer, reportedly became enraged over Dahmer's behavior during the work detail. In an act of brutal violence, Scarver attacked Dahmer and Anderson with a metal bar from the prison weight room. Dahmer and Anderson were critically injured. Despite attempts at medical intervention, Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced dead shortly afterward. He was 34 years old. The attack shocked both the prison system and the public, yet for many it was a grimly fitting end to a life marked by cruelty and terror. Christopher Scarver later explained that he believed he was carrying out a form of divine retribution, though his motives were never officially codified beyond his own statements. Dahmer's death brought an abrupt closure to the life of one of America's most infamous serial killers. In prison, the man who had once held complete control over his victims found himself powerless, facing the very real consequences of a system designed to contain him, yet unable to escape the animosity that his crimes had inspired. His notoriety ensured that his murder became as sensationalized in the media as his arrest and trial, cementing his story as a cautionary tale about evil, control, and the limits of justice. Though he was gone, Dahmer's legacy remained. The horror of his crimes, combined with the shocking circumstances of his death, left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. From his apartment of horrors to the courtroom, and finally to the prison where he met his end, Jeffrey Dahmer's life was a study in darkness, a reminder that even the most controlled environments cannot erase the consequences of profound moral corruption.